Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to participants around the world. Clayton Utz and Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer are pleased to have over 500 of our clients participating in today's interactive webinar entitled Workplace Issues Arising from Coronavirus, Decoding the New Normal. The pace of change in global employment markets has been much faster than anyone anticipated. In response to the World Health Organisation declaring COVID-19 a pandemic, the Australian and state governments have rapidly escalated and imposed significant and unprecedented restrictions. Businesses have had to be proactive, creative and understanding. Imagining our future is of course an important task, but with consideration to where we are at now and how we got here, today's webinar is more about us sharing with you our insights in the short, medium and longer term and what we hope is not too distant post-coronavirus crisis future. Participants will have an opportunity today to ask questions during the webinar, and we will encourage you to and we will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible. If we're unable to answer your questions, we'll come back to you directly at the end of the webinar. There's a question and answer facility on the web page that you're looking at, and you can submit your questions through that. Some of you have already submitted some questions, and we've endeavoured to incorporate those questions and answers into our presentation today. I would now like to introduce our esteemed panel who will be sharing their thoughts and views with you on the impact of COVID-19 on workplaces across Australia, Asia and Europe. Holly Inslee is a Senior Associate in the People and Rewards practice at Freshfields. Holly is based in London and regularly advises on cross-border employment issues and workforce change programs. She is also a member of Freshfields' Global Investigations practice and has a particular focus on whistleblowing and corporate culture. Recently, she has spent a significant amount of time advising on the responses of UK employers to the COVID-19 crisis and its longer-term impact. Stephanie Chu is a Senior Associate in the People and Reward practice at Freshfields and is based in Hong Kong. Stephanie advises employers on compliance with employment and privacy legislation in Hong Kong and on issues surrounding recruitment and redundancies. She has a particular experience with cross-border work and regularly advises employers on the employment aspects of international merger and acquisitions, as well as cross-border investigations. Shay McCartney and Christy Miller are both partners at Clayton Utz, based in Brisbane. Shay has a strong safety background and specialises in industrial relations, compliance and incident response. Christy specialises in industrial relations, employment and discrimination law. Both Shay and Christy have been helping employers navigate their responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, looking at the problem from all angles with a view to finding solutions that best meet client needs, and then working with our clients on implementation and management. And my name is Saul Harbin. I'm today's moderator, and I'm a partner in the National Practice Group leader of the Workplace Relations, Employment and Safety Practice Group at Clayton Utz. In preparing for today's webinar, we've looked at and identified 4 themes that we would like to explore over the course of the next hour. The themes we'll be looking at are, firstly, what happens next? What we anticipate will happen immediately after government has lifted restrictions. Secondly, what is the damage? What are the longer-term impacts? Thirdly, riding the second wave, contingency planning for a resurgence. And fourth, gazing into the post-coronavirus crystal ball. So I'm now going to move into the first themes, what happens next? And I'd like to commence today's discussion with asking this question of Christy Miller. Christy, what happens next? Do we anticipate a return to normal as soon as government restrictions are lifted?
No, I don't think so, Saul, and I don't think anyone's anticipating that. I think we need to plan, obviously, for a real graduated return to the workplace for all workers. And there are a number of questions that I think businesses can be asking themselves or planning for now, particularly in terms of the management of their staff. So how do we manage that graduated return? How do we choose between workers who will be part of that first wave of return and those who will be part of the second wave, noting that some will want to be part of the first and some will not want to be part of that first wave, but that might not be a choice that is available to all employees. And how do we continue to monitor health and wellbeing throughout that period? So I think they're the sort of the questions that the business needs to be posing to themselves now, because I think inevitably what we're going to see is an uptick immediately following the return to work phase in workers' compensation claims, adverse action claims in the Australian jurisdiction, and discrimination complaints. And these types of claims will be focused on how the employees felt or perceived that they were treated, both during the COVID shutdown, but also during that reintegration period. Now, business has a real opportunity here to manage or at least minimise the extent of some of these claims by taking some simple proactive measures. I think by being transparent in terms of their communications with employees, both on a group level and on an individual level where necessary, and documenting those communications. So reassuring to employees in writing the impact of the return to work phase, what it means for employees who's part of that first, second or third wave as necessary, and keeping that really clear paper trail. And that's a word that you'll probably hear me use a lot today, because I think we need it, Saul, not only in terms of providing an available defence for employers in circumstances where they are subject to one of these types of claims on return, but also to ensure that we can openly and actively communicate with our employees who, in this very difficult phase, are not going to be taking on board all the information that we communicate with them.
Thanks, Christy. And turning now to Shay. Shay, if employers have to make decisions about whether to, for example, delay returns to work on WHS grounds for, say, older workers who might be classified as vulnerable workers, is this likely to cause any discrimination issues for them?
Thanks, Saul. And that's a really difficult question that companies are already struggling with. One of the, I guess, easiest answers is yes, in all states in Australia, and Stephanie and Holly, I'm sure, can comment on the situation overseas, but there are exemptions to discrimination laws on the basis of genuine health and safety protections. But it's not simply a matter that we can say, well, if you're a vulnerable worker or you're over 70, then we don't select you or we don't allow you to return to work. We actually have to document and have a very clear understanding of what that health and safety risk is. Something that companies are finding very difficult with a lot of changing information about what is the actual level of risk, what is the level of risk specific to our country, our state, our business, our actual workplace. Many workers working at home, for example, has a different level of risk than if they're in the workplace, which all still may be able to be managed. So the first step is actually to do that very clear risk assessment and to understand what it is that work they'll be doing, how that work has changed from their previous workplace or what they were doing, and then document, well, what are the measures that can be put in place to ensure their health and safety. And it's only really then, if we can't ensure their health and safety, and it wouldn't be reasonably practicable to, that you then would select them not to return to the workplace. The other thing I think that needs to be sort of put into that mix is the broader, longer term planning, because as businesses are now looking at, well, what does the future look like? The people that they bring back first, are they the core group of leaders who are going to provide a health and safety conscious workplace, who are going to lead the culture of actually being able to make these transitions? And how do they plan for what is likely, as Christy said, probably not a return to what the workplace looked before, but perhaps there's going to be redundancies, perhaps there's going to be restructuring, and the decisions and the paper trail that they create now are likely to lead into those future decisions. So setting that up very clearly at this time is really critical.
Thanks, Shay. And in terms of work health and safety obligations, is there anything employers should be considering now as they start to prepare to return to work? Are there any tips or tricks you've identified there?
Yeah, so I think the word planning is the absolute paradigm that we have to look at, because as we, and as Christy suggested, probably a scaling back of operations and workplaces, there are really complex laws that organisations have to grapple with. So in Australia, every state has different health directives. We all have mainly consistent work health and safety laws, but there are some nuances between them, including in relation to the provision of PPE, including in relation to specific workers' compensation requirements, reporting obligations. And so workforces have to actually sit down and understand what are their minimum statutory requirements for compliance. And then that sort of sits to one side as the regulatory compliance, and then they have to work out, well, what is the actual changes to the work that we're doing, and how does that actually change all of the risk assessments that we've done previously? If we're introducing new health and safety measures, and we've discussed this in particularly the mining context, but if we're introducing drug and alcohol testing, or we're introducing temperature testing, while we do that, we're creating other risks that also need to be managed. So in bringing in these new measures, are we actually changing the risk assessments that we have in place? Have we got more isolated workforces? How do we plan for people having to work remotely and change our operating structures to do that? And the only way to do that and meet both those statutory minimums and our common law duty of care to ensure the health and safety of our workers, but also the public who we might also expose, is to step right back to first principles planning and actually undertake those risk assessments, have clear documented plans that fall out of them, that implement the controls that we identify, and then have a staged plan for how we're going to make sure they're effective. And I think that the full stop on that point is to say, well, we've now had some period of time to start looking at how in our own country and in our own workplaces, but then also overseas, how some of those control measures have been effective and some of them have not been effective. And so how does that change what we know? And do we now need to start doing review programs, doing auditing, looking at what the changes of that level of information that we have, and feed that all back into our systems?
Thank you, Shay. Christy, we've had a lot of questions come through from participants in preparing the presentation around the concept of remote working issues, such as the ability to monitor employees while they're working from home, and what reasonable performance monitoring measures can be implemented. Should employers be lowering their performance expectations in the current environment?
Thanks, Saul. Look, I think the simple answer to that question is no. We can't be lowering performance expectations, but I think there is inevitably a difficulty there associated with moving to anything beyond formal performance management. So I'm talking about moving to termination based on performance management in circumstances where all of our performance management has been out of the office. So I appreciate that it creates an administrative and management difficulty for organisations when we have individuals remotely working and not being physically present, so we can check their attendance, check their level of concentration or engagement with the workforce. But I don't think that means that we necessarily reduce those expectations. We need to find other ways of checking and monitoring really that work product. So if attendance, as a very simple example, is what we are concerned about, instead of actually seeing when they arrive and leave for the day, are we looking at things like log in and log off times on computers? Have we really looked to the full extent to which the technology can help us monitor their engagement and their presence online? The other thing I think is really important, and this is something that I think employers generally struggle with, putting aside the COVID-19 pandemic, it's about setting those really clear expectations, and never has that been more important. And again, it comes back to that paper trail. Have we told the employee in writing very clearly what those performance expectations are on them, and that they haven't changed now that they are out of the workplace? I think this is where we see, particularly from an employment lawyer perspective, we see a lot of performance management processes fall down. And if we think about not lowering expectations, but making sure that as employers, we are thinking all the time about, and this is worst case scenario, if we want to use that performance management process to support, for example, a termination of employment. Do we have the documentation there that demonstrates that we have clearly set those expectations? Have we provided them with a sufficient amount of warnings, counselling, coaching in relation to improving that performance, or what steps they can take to improve that performance? If we think about those employees in Australia who have access to our unfair dismissal regime, and we think about the two planks of that jurisdiction that we need to, or the two hurdles that we really need to overcome. A, do we have a valid reason for termination? And performance will be a valid reason for termination if we have met those hurdles in terms of being clear about what those performance expectations are. But we also, and I think the one that becomes very relevant around this managing performance in the time of COVID-19 is whether the termination, if we move to termination now, would that termination be considered too harsh? So I do think we need to think about not lowering expectations, but increasing the amount of supervision to the extent required, increasing the amount of warning or counselling or feedback or material that is provided to the employees to ensure that they can, to the extent possible, meet those hurdles. Because I think that's really where employers are going to fall down in circumstances where performance management either eventuates in or results in an unfair dismissal type claim, an adverse action type claim, or spins off into a workers' compensation type area. That documentation, that clearly defining the expectations and setting that paper trail will be vitally important for that process.
Thanks, Christy. Holly, you're based in London. What sort of issues are you seeing across Europe in terms of employers starting to plan for the lifting of restrictions?
Well, firstly, I would echo a lot of what Christy and Shay have already said. So the sorts of discrimination questions are relevant in Europe as well. And that's both from a kind of age or other vulnerable characteristics perspective, if you've got somebody who perhaps has underlying health issues. Also, I guess slightly more unexpected discrimination issues. So as it has become apparent, different racial groups seem to be impacted more by COVID-19 because, for example, of kind of section of society that they occupy, standards of wealth. And if you look at your workforce and the roles that your different ethnic groups occupy, certainly in London, it seems like there's a kind of disproportionate number of Black and minority ethnic employees in more manual jobs. They may be sort of, I guess, in the front line exposed a bit more than some other ethnic groups. And so there are actually sort of indirect race discrimination issues that are starting to come out of all of this. In the UK, at least, I think everybody is holding their breath and waiting for some more detailed guidance on what the lifting of the restrictions will look like. We saw some guidance very briefly over the weekend, which was then taken down, but it indicated, for example, that every employer will be required to do a brand new risk assessment before anybody can come back into the workplace. Strict requirements around social distancing as part of the risk assessment, considering whether you have to provide PPE to your employees. And, it may have reached the Australian shores that actually PPE has been a really controversial topic in the UK, suggestions that even health workers don't have access to sufficient stock. So I think employers are then scratching their head and thinking, well, what do I do? How do I get hold of anything I might need to provide my employees with? And there's the really practical points, like if you're in a big city, then you might be able to make your workplace safe, but how do you get people to work safely? And as somebody who is well used to navigating the London Underground at rush hour, I can tell you that social distancing is not really a concept that any London commuters recognise. So actually, there's a real expectation, I think, that anybody who's able to work from home will keep working from home for many weeks or even months to come because of difficulties like that. Whatever the employer can do at work, getting people there safely is just going to be an additional challenge that they might not be able to overcome. The one thing I would add is that data privacy has become a really important issue across Europe. So if you think about the sorts of steps employers might take as people are coming back to work, asking them detailed questions about their health, maybe their family's health, possibly thinking about taking temperatures at the door of the office, you're starting to process some kind of sensitive personal data there. And it feels really strange to even be talking about doing temperature testing. You know, data privacy standards are really, really high across Europe. And it would be unheard of to start intruding into people's private lives ordinarily in this way. But you're balancing data privacy concerns on the one hand with your duty as an employer on the other. And a lot of data protection authorities across Europe are starting to issue guidance on that topic. And for the most part, being relatively pragmatic and making it clear that they don't expect data privacy to stand in the way of actually securing people's health and safety. So a lot to grapple with for employers on that front as well.
Thanks, Holly. And I think your comments around transport to and from work and the use of public transport are really resonating with the audience, because I can just see on the moderator the questions that are coming through. We've had a number of questions being asked around the topic of whether or not an employer has a duty of care in a return to work sort of post-COVID-19 environment to make sure that an employee is able to safely travel to work on, say, public transport. So I think that's an issue we will have a look at, and we might circulate a little bit of material around after the webinar. But it's a great point. Stephanie, you're based in Hong Kong, and Asia is ahead of the curve in terms of its experience with COVID-19. What do you think are the key lessons that can be learned from the Asian experience in terms of dealing with COVID-19?
Sure. I think let me start off by saying that it's probably still a stretch to say that things are completely back on track in Asia. There's so many countries here, such as Japan and Singapore, that are still under lockdown. In Hong Kong, for example, we're also under still partial lockdown. But I think for the most part, we are starting to see signs of normality being restored again in this part of the world. I think one of the most important lessons we've learned here is to be mindful of your legal, regulatory, and contractual obligations as an employer, but importantly to understand what those obligations mean in the context of your own business. So, for example, we've seen China and Singapore governments being quite prescriptive in terms of what employers need to do to ensure the health and safety of employees, such as providing PPE, measuring temperatures of employees, maintaining a safe distance between seats in an office. In contrast, Hong Kong is a bit more relaxed in this area and hasn't really quite clearly spelled out what employers need to do. However, like in most other jurisdictions, employers in Hong Kong are required to ensure the health and safety of employees. And like Shay says, employers generally have an implied duty of care towards the employees. What this means is that companies will need to be confident that in asking their employees to return to the workplace, that they will not be compromising their safety. I think the difficulty here is, of course, that this means different things for different employers. And in the absence of specific government guidance, lots of companies are understandably very concerned and slightly confused about how these obligations translate into things that they should do or shouldn't do to facilitate a safe return to the workplace. And I think as with most things in life, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach here. I think what is right for a small company with, say, 10 employees working in an office is going to be very different from a large organization with hundreds of employees, with most of them working in a factory, for example. I think it's important for organizations to carry out a risk assessment, having regard to things like the size of the workforce, whether any of the employees are particularly vulnerable, the type of work that's being carried out, the layout of the office even, and the location of the office. And as you say, the commute to and from the office is a very interesting topic. And certainly here in Hong Kong and in parts of Asia, employers do need to be responsible for the safe commute of their employees to and from work. And I think one of the ways we've seen companies approach that here in Hong Kong is to implement flexible or staggered working hours, allowing employees to come into work at different hours to avoid kind of peak hour crowds. And I think it's important here to remember that just because it's the end of a government-mandated lockdown doesn't mean your employees should be back at their desk the next day, even though, of course, the gut instinct would be to resume things as quickly as possible to make up for lost time. However, I think if companies don't take all of the reasonable steps to provide a reasonable and safe working environment for employees, whatever that means for the company, then you run the risk of having an infection in the workplace, which is, of course, far worse and more damaging to your business and bottom line. And I think for that reason, we're seeing many employers in Asia, and particularly in Hong Kong, being quite slow and very cautious in facilitating the return back to work, particularly where it's a multinational company where their international offices are still under lockdown.
Thank you, Stephanie. If we now turn to thinking about what damage has been caused and what the longer term impacts might be for businesses and for employers and employees in relation to COVID-19, I'd like to pose this question to Shay. We've discussed the period immediately after the government's restrictions have been lifted, but Shay, what are the longer term impacts and what is the damage that can be caused?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Saul, and again, one that's much harder to plan for, particularly when we have so many imminent and clear and present dangers to have to deal with. But one that I think organisations need to keep a very careful eye on, and if you take the Dreamworld example where we had some tragic fatalities in recent times, and the coronial recommendations that came out were incredibly damning in relation to the measures that had been taken for maintenance, decisions that were made under pressure and their processes and procedures. And if I look at what organisations are doing at the moment is that they're really just trying to get by in an environment where the decisions are being made as to how to survive. And even our regulators have come out and said, while they're not accepting a lower level of health and safety, that they won't be reviewing or looking for sort of administrative compliance issues, and that they will be taking a pragmatic approach in relation to compliance. Now, that's meant to be a pragmatic approach in relation to if there are things like you can't give face-to-face training, you might still be able to give online training or other forms of training. It's not meant to suggest that workers' health and safety can be put at risk because a company has significant financial constraints. But there is a reality as we look at the impacts on organisations that they're having to make very hard decisions about what maintenance they can afford, what health and safety training programs they can afford, what manning levels they can afford, what emergency response they can afford to keep in a redundancy. And yet what we've actually seen is the flip side of that, which is if you're caught in a very significant emergency without sufficient PPE, without sufficient measures in place, without having run our plans, then organisations can be in a very difficult way. So I think the first one is that there is a lack of resources being put into health and safety, longer term health and safety issues that could come back to bite companies very significantly. The second issue is that a lot of companies that needed to or were intending to carry out organisational change have now sort of had their organisations sort of flipped up. And so as Christy was talking about, hard decisions about performance management have been put to the side, organisational restructure has been, perhaps put on the side. And so all of those programs that have been put to the side, I think in the future will come back, but with a very different lens put over them. And so organisations, I think, are going to look very, very different come the sort of the other side in the longer term. And then I guess the third point I would make would be around the officer obligations and officer liability. And before we came into the pandemic, there was a really strong in Australia and I believe internationally. Again, Holly and Stephanie would tell me if it's the same way overseas, but from what I've observed, this very strong focus on officers having to be accountable for the decisions made by their companies. And I think that we've had a sort of a quiet step from that, while, you know, officers are really just being left to cope with the lifeblood of their organisations. But I think what we're going to see as we come out the other side is perhaps even greater scrutiny on the leadership decisions of some of these big organisations and how they have fared, and whether they put workers at risk, whether they looked after their employees' wages, whether they've allowed systemic cyber and data breaches, and, you know, made decisions that harmed people in a really large way. And I think what we're going to see from that will be both individual prosecutions, personal impacts on officers, and then also, you know, class actions that are going to, unfortunately, craft the landscape for a period to come, I think.
Oh, thank you, Shay. Holly, what are you expecting to see in the UK and Europe? Are redundancies and restructuring on the cards?
I think, unfortunately, they are. Subject to one caveat, which is that a lot of European governments have put in place wage subsidy programmes or other forms of financial support. And some of those programmes have come with conditions attached, so restrictions on making redundancies during receipt of that support and for a period thereafter. So there are some European countries where employers will find, at least for a short time, that their hands are tied. There are other countries like the UK where the government support programmes didn't come with any sort of conditions, and in fact they sort of went to the opposite end and acknowledged that really they might just be buying time until redundancy decisions had to be made, so just trying to keep people in their jobs while the worst of this is happening. And I think that is something that we're going to see borne out in practice. I think a lot of employers, when they find the safety net of government support has fallen away, but the economy hasn't yet fully bounced back, or they're having to operate under capacity to kind of deal with the issues we've just been describing in terms of social distancing and not having too many people in the workplace at once, they'll find that they're very quickly under pressure to make quite significant savings. We are seeing quite a lot of cost management planning already, not necessarily redundancies, but certainly looking at other savings that can be made. I think we're encouraging people pretty strongly to remember the lessons learned from the last financial crisis, where understandably organisations reacted pretty quickly and pretty significantly, and in some cases cut too deep into their pool of talent and then hampered their ability to bounce back when the economy was starting to recover, and they found they had the opposite problem, which was retention issues and gaps in their talent pool that had to be plugged. So we are really pushing the alternatives to redundancy as well as redundancy at the extreme end. And I think the other point I would just make, if we're talking about kind of damage and longer term impact, is that I suspect a lot of employers might be storing up longer term employee retention issues. And it goes back to the point that Christy started with around messaging and communication and the importance of people understanding what's happening and why. And I think if employees feel that they haven't been treated well in all of this by their employer, then, you know, we're not seeing the impact yet, but I suspect at some point down the line, employers may find that they're suffering retention issues once the market picks up and once people can look elsewhere, because they're reacting to how they've been treated right now.
So it sounds like obviously a considered and carefully thought through and moderated response is what's happening across Europe, which is a little bit different to what we all saw for those of us that were around and lived through the sort of the knee-jerk reaction that occurred after the GFC. So that's obviously a really interesting observation. Stephanie, how do you think companies, or do you think companies can future-proof their businesses from an employment perspective?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's fair to say that during this period when most employees have been working remotely or working from home, that employers have probably spotted various different deficiencies in their contractual terms or collective bargaining agreements, and may want to look at these issues more closely. So, for example, one of the most common questions I've had during this time is whether an employee can be asked to take all of their accrued and even unaccrued holidays during this time, so that they don't use up their holidays when things return back to normal. And then another issue we recently looked at for a client was how do you ensure that employees are in a secure place during video conferences? What if you discuss confidential mandates, but this is overheard by other members of their household, and how do you mitigate those confidentiality risks? Of course, these types of issues existed before COVID-19, but many employers are now finding that employment contracts and employment policies are insufficient to deal with the new challenges of their employees working from home, and are looking to do kind of wholesale reviews of their employment terms. And there are also things like unpaid leave arrangements in exceptional circumstances, working from home requirements, medical leave or consent to some of the things that we've been talking about, like temperature screening, or perhaps even more permanent changes to the way that work is to be performed, the equipment that's used, shift patterns, work locations, etc. And I think these changes can take two forms. Firstly, changing the standard form contracts for new joiners. That's more easily done as a technical matter, although the company will need to figure out what the right changes are to put in for these new joiners. I think changes for existing employees are clearly going to be more difficult because, generally speaking, there's nothing special about the circumstances right now that would override the normal contractual rules. So if you normally need to have employee consent to change the terms and conditions of employment, then the same would apply here. So it's therefore difficult to make these changes in certain countries. For example, in Japan and Indonesia, where employee consent will be required. And if you operate in countries where your workforce is covered by works council or rules and collective bargaining, then information and consultation obligations may also arise. And if you want to introduce new terms or new ways of working, you're likely to need to consult with those work councils and representatives and employees. So I think the key here is to consider what you need to do to make sure your terms of employment catches up with the new ways of working.
So interesting there, Stephanie, the comments you made about new joiners. I'm just going to pivot to Christy and ask her to talk about rejoiners. So the Australian government has come out and said, look, if you've recently made someone redundant, can you look at rehiring that employee and utilising the Commonwealth Government's JobKeeper program? Christy, can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that could impact on the ability of an employer to make someone redundant twice? Is that even possible? Or are there any risks that can arise in relation to rehiring someone and then ultimately possibly having to look at letting them go a second time?
Yeah, thanks, Saul. It certainly seems odd, doesn't it, and not in keeping with what we would normally expect of a redundancy process in the Australian jurisdiction. Certainly there would normally, putting aside the COVID-19 pandemic, be some real questions asked if we rehired someone and then 6 months later, say following the conclusion of the JobKeeper subsidy regime, then move to termination for reasons of redundancy again. But I think we need to look at redundancy after COVID-19 with a really different lens. And I think Holly has already mentioned some things here. She spoke about the UK or European governments talking about just buying time, really. And I think that's what really the JobKeeper regime is doing, particularly in these circumstances where businesses have previously decided to move to redundancy and have rehired for the purposes of ensuring that those individuals form eligible employees for the purposes of the JobKeeper subsidy, but then ultimately make a determination that their business can no longer support those positions or a range of positions and need to move to a redundancy situation again. I think it is going to certainly be possible for that to happen, not to say that it is without risk, but I think there are certainly ways of managing that risk. And as I say, we need to look at that COVID-19 in a bit of a bubble. This JobKeeper regime, while it works in conjunction with and sits alongside the existing provisions of the Fair Work Act, it really creates a framework unto itself. It creates new stand-down provisions. It's providing a payment in the event of stand down in these circumstances, which normally under the Fair Work Act we don't have any payments in the event of stand down if you trigger the provisions under the legislation. In this instance, if employers have rehired people and are looking on a reassessment of the business, and it has to be a current assessment of the business, we can't simply say that because they were redundant at time A, they should be now redundant or their employment redundant at time B. You'd need to make a reassessment of whether that position is operationally required, and move through the appropriate consultation provisions or provisions that are available in either your enterprise agreements, contracts, or awards. But the way of doing that is following those processes, again, documenting and having that really clear paper trail in terms of the reasons for the redundancy and that consultation process to really minimise any residual risk associated with a second move to redundancy. But I certainly do think it is possible, and I think it will be inevitable in some cases.
Thank you, Christy. I'd now like to move to our third theme for this afternoon, which is riding the second wave, contingency planning around a possible resurgence of COVID-19. If I can turn now to Stephanie. Stephanie, we're seeing a resurgence in COVID-19 cases in places that had early success in minimising the impact, such as Singapore in particular, where I think the government has now announced a second lockdown period of another month through to 1 June. Should employers start contingency planning for a potential second lockdown period?
Yes, I think the answer is definitely yes. We've seen a second wave of cases, as you say, in parts of Asia, so we have good reason to expect that this will happen in other parts of the world. I think the fact is that until there is a vaccine in place, the majority of our population remains susceptible to infection. And it's difficult to pin down how businesses can prepare for this, as it will depend on the type of business that your company operates, the size of your workforce, and importantly, where you operate. But I think there are some common themes. I think most businesses are probably facing a patchwork of different rules and regulations, especially if you operate in more than one industry or more than one location, and each jurisdiction will have its own unique circumstances. So government orders are likely to be different everywhere you turn. I think it's important to be on top of these guidelines and the rules in the jurisdiction and those applying specifically to your industry. I think from a business continuity perspective, since a second wave could cause an increase in absences at work, companies need to consider which employees can perform or need to perform essential services and functions, and whether they can do so remotely, and which employees are required to be on site to perform essential functions. I think during the period when the lockdown may be easing up, but you think that a second wave of infections may hit, it makes sense for employees to continue to work from home where it is possible. And this applies especially where you've got vulnerable employees, such as those who have long-term illnesses. And I think it's important to consider whether certain employees should be cross-trained so that people can step up and perform essential functions if the original employees performing those functions are unfortunately infected. I think, as I've said earlier, just because government restrictions have been lifted doesn't necessarily mean that it is right for the business to be back in full swing the next day. It may make sense to take a phased approach like others have talked about. And I think depending on where your business is, it may make sense to contact your local public health authority for recommendations, guidance, and specific proposals to allow you to reopen your business when things have calmed down.
Thanks, Stephanie. That's a really interesting idea about using the possibility of a second wave as planning around multi-skilling for some employees and introducing some different skill sets across the workforce. Holly, what have you seen in London in relation to planning for a second possible wave or breakout of COVID-19? Is there anything you can share with us?
I think it's fair to say that the planning for a second wave is not particularly advanced. I think everybody is concentrating very much at the moment on getting out of this first period of lockdown, understandably, which makes it quite a hard angle to sell when you start telling people they should be planning for round number 2. But I think planning is important, and that's either because there might be a second lockdown, or as Stephanie said, it might almost be just an extension of this first period, because it's so hard to envisage getting back to proper normality until there's a vaccine, for example, that these working from home arrangements that are now into kind of week 7 in the UK are going to go on for a significant period to come. And it felt to me like when we transitioned to working from home and then more significant lockdown measures, that happened quite fast. And some employers had done a degree of planning for that. Some probably hadn't done enough. And even those who had planned pretty well, I think, had to put their plans into action probably faster than they'd anticipated that they would need to. And certainly for the last few weeks, it's felt like everyone's been operating in this mindset that, it's temporary, it's an emergency response to a crisis. I think we're probably going to have to transition out of that mindset slightly and into, maybe this is the new normal, at least for a significant period to come, so that employers do start getting into the mindset of doing the business as usual things that we've already talked about. So performance management, figuring out how you go through disciplinary processes, all the normal mechanics that you go through with your workforce, that at least in the UK, it feels to me has slightly been put on hold. I think if you were going to go into a second period of lockdown or an extended period of this first lockdown, there are some lessons that employers should be learning from their experience so far. They should think through the teething problems they've had and be prepared for those from the outset next time round. On one particular issue that I know a lot of employers in London came across was their very international workforces getting on planes and flying home wherever home is, and then working from home there. And, HR teams understandably trying to accommodate that and saying, yes, that's fine, off you go. We appreciate you'll want to go back to your family and work from home, without actually understanding some of the wider implications of that. So from a tax perspective, is the employer then creating a taxable presence in that jurisdiction? From a regulatory perspective, if you're talking about traders going and doing a regulated activity from a new location, do you have any sort of issue with your regulatory licenses? People really did, I think, get caught out on those sorts of points. And if this is going to go on for some time, or if it's going to happen in a second wave, I think you'd want to be ready for that next time round.
Thank you. Shay, we've had a really interesting question from the audience, which I might pose to you because I think you're well positioned to answer this. The question's been asked is this: what approaches to return to work risk assessments would you recommend in a climate where the government and public health advisors may be saying or warning, look, that there is likely to be secondary rounds of COVID-19 outbreaks? How does an employer put in place an appropriate checklist or process to get through that, meet their statutory obligations, and make sure they provide a safe system of work for their employees? So have you got any thoughts on those sort of questions?
Yeah, thanks, Saul. I think in Australia we've been incredibly lucky, but I don't think I know as we look around our colleagues around the world, and it's meant that for almost, the vast majority of organisations, our actual safety response has been very much in the hypothetical, protecting people from what could be, rather than having to deal with actual infections, actual risks that are growing and multiplying in your business that you are unable to address. And the impacts, the health impacts themselves of, a contaminated workforce, with some exceptions, particularly in, cruise ships and aged care. Most industries have been incredibly lucky. What that means is that most of our sort of health and safety plans haven't really been tested, and I think most workforces were sort of sent home very, very quickly, much as Holly described in a very, it's an emergency, we can deal with all of these things later. I don't think if and when a second round comes, and it is, you would think, almost inevitable, for Australia it will be a much more different experience, because organisations that are facing a second round are probably going to be much more targeted. They're going to have actual contaminations in their workforce. And also, as we sort of look longer term, perhaps there's going to be broader community transmission. If we don't get to a vaccine stage, presumably at some stage we're going to have to reopen our borders, and we're going to then probably see the same types of, hopefully not to the same scale, but you would think the same, at least some levels of contamination that we've managed to mainly avoid so far. So I think that, you're exactly right, that organisations can't just think that they will roll out the risk assessment that they did, or the measures that they did to send workers home for the sort of the first lockdown, and think that that will be okay for a second wave of contaminations. I think it's going to be a very different situation. I think that, as we talked about before, organisations have to almost redo their risk assessments to develop those controls. They need to start thinking about if they've got targeted issues in their workforce, how they can actually reintegrate workers in a way that minimises that risk. And, we have things like work team A and work team B, so that if work team A gets contaminated, work team B, they're not cross-infecting to work team B. Those very systemic identification of what are the ways that you can separate people. The reviewing of our PPE, every country who has had to face this on any large scale has had significant shortages in the level of PPE. And as Holly was talking about, if there's not enough for the healthcare workers, how can organisations possibly keep their workers safe? And what is even the minimum standards of PPE, because there's quite clear delineation between, and we've seen people with coconuts and oranges on all the memes, but the actual level of PPE that will keep you protected is actually quite high and quite difficult to obtain, and not something that is that you can just buy on a short-term order without significant planning. And then understanding what the actual controls are. We've had a lot of clients, and we talk about temperature testing, and a lot of clients saying to me, when we bring people back to the workplace, we'll be temperature testing them all before they come in, so that's fine. And as Holly talked about, there are some significant privacy issues with that. But it also ignores the fact that there's something like, I think it's a 3-day lag between people who are symptomatic and them having a temperature, not to mention all the people who are asymptomatic who are spreading the disease to the rest of the workforce and who will never have a temperature and won't come up on that control. So without that systematic risk assessment, which is quite targeted for what a second wave looks like, and not just a sort of an unravelling or a reinstating of the first wave, then I think we could be in for quite a bit of trouble. And I think one of our greatest benefits was how quickly we acted. One of our greatest risks in Australia for the second wave is how successful, we could become a victim of our own success, because organisations are now starting to see all of these controls as just difficult issues as to getting back to work, rather than understanding perhaps, what the alternative could look like.
Thanks, Shay. And Christy, are there any additional issues that we should be thinking about from a second wave? And I'm thinking possibly around the psychological impact on an employee of being asked a second time to work from home or to be stood down from work. Have you turned your mind to what some of those impacts may be?
Yeah, thanks, Saul. I think that's a good one to work with, the psychological risk or concern or the mental health issues that generally arise, and that we've seen documented a lot since the commencement of the isolation or the lockdown procedures, particularly here in Australia, but on a broader scale around the world. I think we'll definitely see an increase in the number of employees bringing those types of concerns to the workplace's attention and expecting the employer to manage those. And I'm really sorry to say this to everyone, but I'm going to use those two words that Shay used a lot as well: risk assessment. And we're going to have to do that again and again. We're going to really have to look at the potential psychological impacts on employees of working in isolation for extended periods of time and not having that level of connection to the workplace. And we're going to have to get down and dirty with it, I think, is the simple way of dealing with it. We're going to have to talk to the employees. We're going to have to check in with them on a regular basis, what their concerns are, whether they have concerns, and whether they have any ideas in relation to how to mitigate those risks for them in particular. But it's really working through that simple simple in language, difficult in implementation, risk assessment strategy of identifying the problem as it relates to your individual employees and on a team basis as well, assessing the level of risk that is there in relation to those isolation working requirements, looking at your control measures, which may be as simple as putting in place that additional monitoring and support that I know a range of organisations already do with those regular telephone, video, conference call check-ins, and maintaining and monitoring and reviewing the steps and control measures that you've put in place. So really, I have no good news, unfortunately, on that front. It is more risk assessment for organisations for a longer period of time. It is not relying upon the old. It is starting afresh and reassessing that impact.
Thank you, Christy. Now, we have got 5 minutes left, and we've got the final theme of gazing into the post-coronavirus crystal ball. So I'll ask the panellists to keep your answers as brief as possible. Christy, staying with you for the time being, there's been a lot of chatter in Australia around whether or not COVID-19 might be the basis for the government undertaking some serious IR reform, which we haven't had in Australia since the introduction of the Fair Work Act in 2009. What are your views on that?
I still think our government will be too scared to make any real significant inroads in industrial relations reform. Look, I know there's a number of consultation pieces that the Australian government already had on the go in terms of IR reform that have been put on hold in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, but one of them was a general review in relation to productivity improvement and looking at productivity improvement through the creation of cooperative workplaces. I think that's something that's definitely going to take off. And I know we've seen a lot of goodwill and cooperation between unions and the government and employer organisations in relation to award amendments to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. It might be that the government tries to use this as a platform to really spearhead some more cooperative or facilitative work in the IR reform space, but I certainly don't think we're going to see a return to the work choices days, and I certainly don't want to scare Stephanie and Holly by talking about work choices. But I think we've moved beyond that. I think it's going to be a softer approach, despite the fact that I have heard our Treasurer talk about really pushing ahead with the union penalty bill to try and implement tougher penalties for unions and avail themselves of the deregistration powers there in a bid to really ramp up the construction part of the economy. I really think it's going to be a more softly approach.
Now, we've had a really interesting question about the construction industry and them potentially entering into a downturn in activity a little bit later and a little bit out of step with the rest of the economy. So what we'll do is, with those questions that have come through, which we haven't had a chance to answer, I think we'll prepare some de-identified Q&As and circulate those. But there is a number of really interesting questions that are coming through. Shay, workplace health and safety, do you see COVID-19 as being a catalyst for reform or the introduction of even greater burden for employers in terms of compliance?
So I think from the infectious diseases regime, I think it will be an even greater level of burden. I think most companies have previously had sort of fairly poor planning when it comes to infectious disease, and I think every state has had to enact significant amendments to their legislation, and people probably don't see the changes to the laws that have actually been made to bring in the restrictions, but the actual law changes aren't going away even once the directives are lifted. So I think that we will see a far greater level of continued control in relation to the risk of infectious diseases. I think we'll see a continued push towards the industrial manslaughter, and I think we'll see, as I said before, quite a number of class actions, coronial inquests and royal commissions into the handling of some of these outbreaks. The strange thing, Holly and Stephanie, might find for Australia is because we've actually had so few, we can target where each of them have been, and they've become the subject of significant discussion and debate as to how they occurred, which is probably a bit different when you've got so many and really everyone's in the same boat. And I think that will result in a continued press towards the industrial manslaughter laws and a continued tightening of the impacts and penalties that come out of that, and it'll shape the landscape to come.
Thank you,
can
Shay.
I have one last tip to everyone before I'm told to shut up, which is please just be careful what you ask for in all of these plans and documents. Don't ask for documents and information that you're not going to use and use sensibly. That's my one parting tip for people.
Thank you. Holly, do you think there are any positives that will come from this from a working perspective?
I hope so. Very briefly, because I know we're tight on time, what I do think is that a lot of employers who perhaps previously were reluctant to agree to flexible working arrangements or to working from home are going to find it an awful lot harder to say no to that now, because thousands of employees are demonstrating that working from home is doable. And by extension, I think that actually could have a really positive impact on things like gender diversity, both from the employer perspective, because they're having to agree to arrangements they might previously have been reluctant to agree to, and just the wider workforce perspective. A lot of people will have battled with perhaps negative perceptions of their colleagues when they're working from home or trying to get out of the office in time to do the school run, for example. Everyone's now experienced a bit more of home life and making their job a success from home, and I do think and hope that there might be a positive from a gender diversity perspective coming out of this.
Thanks. Thank you for that. That's a great insight. And finally, Stephanie, do you think things will go back to normal, or will there be a new normal in the way we work? We've had a question about, how long we expect social distancing measures to remain in place. What do you think the new normal will look like for the workplace?
I think to echo what Holly and others have said, I think working from home is definitely here to stay. I think before even the pandemic struck, we were seeing a growing percentage of the workforce having the flexibility to work from home or work remotely here in Asia. But the more conservative work culture here means that flexible remote working in this part of the world is still more the exception than the norm as compared to, say, in the US or in Europe. And as Holly says, I think for any employers who were previously reluctant to allow flexible working or working from home, their ability to say no is now likely to be much lower. And I think the new normal will see lots of business reorganizations and retrainings as certain support functions are at risk. And in the long term, I think the lockdown has accelerated our use and reliance of technology. And as companies put in place their kind of post-COVID-19 recovery plans, there's likely to be a surge of companies outsourcing more routine tasks to machines, which means that certain support roles and functions may be at risk even more quickly than we previously anticipated. And that means that companies may need to look at how to reskill segments of their workforce. And I think, lastly, just very quickly, Christy says there'll be a renewed focus on employee well-being, especially mental health. I think so much of our focus now these days is on the disruption to work, but the increasing use of technology, the kind of stresses in managing work-life integration, and now dealing with the new ways of working after the pandemic, that assisting people with their well-being has never been more important. And also it's important to remember that very sadly, for a lot of people, they're going back to work having lost families or loved ones. And so companies are going to need to address those issues head on, because you'll need to have a workforce coming back that's healthy both physically and mentally.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephanie. We've been going now for 1 hour, 2 minutes and 33 seconds. So we're 2.5 minutes over time, which, given you've had 5 employment lawyers on a webinar, must be world record pace to not be any later than we currently are. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panellists, Stephanie and Holly from Freshfields, and Shay and Christy from Clayton Utes. It's been a wonderful opportunity for us to collaborate with Freshfields and deliver this seminar to both our mutual clients, and it's hopefully something we can do again in the future. I'd like to also thank both the clients and markets and the IT teams from both Clayton Utes and Freshfields. We got the easy job. We just sat in front of a screen and did the talking. They've been working really hard behind the scenes making this happen. So our deepest thanks to both teams This webinar is being recorded and will be available for people to watch later on, and we're happy for you to share it. We also know that we had lots of questions come through, and what we'll endeavour to do is de-identify those questions, as I mentioned earlier, and just do a little Q&A that we will share with the participants, so that people that have taken the time, and we appreciate it, to ask the questions will get some more information. If you want any more information on the webinar, then please contact the Clients and Markets Manager at Clayton Utts Christie Rural, whose details were on the original invite. And we would love to get any feedback that you have got about whether or not this was successful, how you found it, how you found the interactivity, whether or not you want us to do another one, which I'm sure we'd be happy to do. There's some other functionality we can try. There's some online quizzes and polls that we can run during these webinars. So any feedback that we can receive will be greatly received, and we will certainly build it into the next webinar that we run. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you to all our participants for joining. We hope you stay safe, enjoy the rest of your day, and take care. Thank you very much.